Welcome into another edition of Case Files here on WTUL 11 Plus. This week we're tracking a shocking disappearance, murder, and corruption case that shocked a small Northwest Ohio community.
In 2015, the case of Heather Bogle shook the Sandusky community. Bogle was a young mother from Clyde. She vanished after work one night, never to be seen alive again.
For this to happen to them, and now now our child's without a mother. It's just a tragedy.
April 9th, 2015, 28-year-old Heather Bogle leaves work from the Whirlpool plant in Clyde, but she never made it home. Family and friends worried and did everything they could to find her.
Investigators are following up all the leads. We've got several leads coming in, telephone tips, and they are investigating all leads at this point.
The next day, police found Bogle's car parked at a nearby apartment complex. Officers searched the vehicle and found Bogle's body inside the trunk. They say she was beaten and shot, a shocking discovery that left the community afraid and searching for answers.
She was like a daughter to me. She didn't need to die the way she did. She was a good friend and a good mother. Good spirits, had a smile on her face all the time.
At first, the investigation led authorities to focus on several potential suspects, but extensive inquiries and a lack of evidence cleared them of any involvement. The case remained unsolved for more than 2 years, again, leaving the community frustrated and seeking justice.
Just rallying around to show that the family that we love them and we want to support them in any way we can, and that we loved Heather and she was a big part of our lives.
There was a new sheriff in town in 2017.
It did not come from a tip. It was actually evidence that we discovered once we took the investigation back and kind of went through some old evidence. And then we took that old evidence and kind of built upon it.
Sheriff Chris Hilton took over in Sandusky County that January. A short time later, investigators got a break in the case and arrested Daniel Myers. Myers worked with Bogle at the Whirlpool plant. Evidence linked him to the crime, which led to aggravated murder charges against him.
I thank God every day that Heather fought you so that no one can ever endure this pain ever again. I feel no punishment will be good enough for what you have done.
He pleaded guilty in 2019. A judge then sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a step forward for closure for Bogle's loved ones.
You didn't give any thought to what Heather would be enduring, and she was taken away from her daughter and us. I hope she haunts you for the rest of your days that you are breathing, because you deserve that and so much more.
But the investigation didn't end there. It uncovered misconduct within the Sandusky County Sheriff's Office. Allegations surfaced that Detective Sean O'Connell mishandled the case. He would be charged with tampering with evidence and later convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison.
This was a story with so many layers. You pull back one layer of the onion and you get another. And, you use the word botched to describe the police work. That's almost kind. I mean, it ends up being criminal. The detective, Sean O'Connell, just focused on 3 people, and to the exclusion of other evidence that was coming in or evidence that sort of proved these people didn't have anything to do with it, he just kept right on these people. Some really bad police work. Of course, the other part of the story is some excellent police work that got to the bottom of this mystery of who killed Heather Bogle.
The accountability continues. Sheriff Kyle Overmeyer was convicted on drug charges not related to the case.
One was scheduled and taken and with negative results, and I wanted to prove that. I don't even drink alcohol. And I wanted that to be as proof that there's no issue with me as well.
Subsequent investigations exposed significant challenges within local law enforcement. And while Bogle's family continues to mourn, the resolution of the case has prompted calls for reform within the community.
And I think Jim Axelrod describing this case as an onion is a great analogy, because we've just started to scratch the surface there in that piece of where this Heather Bogle case led us.
Yeah, and I had kind of forgotten about this case, but this is the 10-year anniversary of it. And when I started looking into it again, it's amazing how many different elements were actually involved in this case. We're going to get into that more, but Absolutely unbelievable.
And one of the people we can't do a podcast here without is Matt Westerhold. He is the executive editor of a group of newspapers here in our area, and specifically the Sandusky Register, and really broke open all of the corruption that started here. So thanks so much for coming in and sharing your expertise on this case.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to talk first about who was Heather Bogle. You covered this case top to bottom, start to finish. Who was Heather Bogle? And talk to us about the sentiment in the area when she disappeared and this case went unsolved.
Well, she was 28 and she worked at Whirlpool. She was a young mother. She did not go to pick up her daughter from school and was reported missing right then. Her sister and her cousin worked diligently, and her brother worked diligently for 2 years to try and get authorities to give her justice. And ultimately they won. They're the ones who did it. She worked at Whirlpool, and I called it a botched case because you can't say it's criminal until someone else says it's criminal. I wouldn't say it's criminal, but I would say it's botched, and then it turned out to be very criminal.
So Heather is working at Whirlpool, like you said. She was in the overnight shift, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right, and it turned out that Danny Myers worked with her, but that was never looked at for 2 years until Chris Hilton was elected in 2016. That was never looked at. Whether there was someone at work. It was never looked at until Sheriff Hilton took office.
So talk to us about what initially came out about the suspects. There were 3 suspects that were initially identified by the detective on the case, Sean O'Connell.
Right.
And why did he say he felt these 3? He publicly identified these people, by the way, before there were any charges filed. Why did he say he was looking at these 3, Kiana Bohr, Kyrie Jeffries, and Omar Satchel?
You know, I never figured that out. It never made sense why you would want to effectively frame. I mean, because he manufactured a video that made it look like Kiana Bohr was admitting her involvement.
And this was a woman that just happened to live in the apartment complex where Heather Bogle lived?
Right. No.
Or where the car
where
was
the car
found.
was, where the body was discovered. They knocked on her door, and O'Connell had a history with her boyfriend, who was the father of her children. He had a history of sending that man to prison on drug charges that were later overturned, I believe, and then were later remade. But so he had a history. And the first inkling we had that he had a suspect, well, there was Tyree, who was the gun, which seemed, you know, he didn't have a gun. He just, Tyree's girlfriend couldn't give her gun, so it was stolen, and Tyree got blamed for stealing it, even though there was no evidence of that. So that was strange, and we didn't understand that. And then we get a call from Kiana Bohr, who was in her 20s, I think, and she told us that Detective O'Connell was harassing her. At her apartment, they turned it upside down. You know how they search, and they don't have to be responsible for taking care. So they turned her apartment upside down.
They went to her workplace.
Yes, they went to her workplace.
And really, like, the evidence was that Heather Bogle was found wearing a Mickey Mouse t-shirt, and Kiana Bohr had a Mickey Mouse sweatshirt or something.
It was convoluted. It was convoluted. And we agreed to go talk to Kiana Bohr, and we drove into Fremont. The reporter at that time I was working with was Courtney Astolfi, and she and I drove to Fremont, and we met with Kiana Bohr at is it Tim Hortons? It's the only time I've ever been to a Tim Hortons. And she told us her story that she would stop for gas and O'Connell would pull up and talk smack to her.
Hey, Matt, I want to ask you this. So when you were going to meet with her, you probably had maybe some sort of preconceived notion in your mind, hey, I believe this woman possibly did this, or she probably is guilty of this, but I hear her out. What was going through your mind before you met her?
I guess I didn't really know. I mean, by that time I had experience with O'Connell, so I was mistrustful of O'Connell. I mean, there were probably a half dozen different cases where his behavior was unusual for a detective. Behavior that I'd never seen in any other detective. So I was interested in what she had to say. I had no conception that O'Connell might be a racist or anything like that. I mean, the three suspects were all black, young black people, but that didn't click. So I just wanted to hear what she had to say, and when she spoke to us, I mean, both Courtney and I were like, yeah, that's a woman who's getting framed. And we were scared for her, literally.
Yeah. Well, we do have some sound from many years ago when Kyrie Jeffries talked about where he was at the time of Heather Bogle's murder.
Did you know Heather Bogle?
Not at all.
Did you have anything to do with her murder?
No, I did not. I also gave my alibi, which is valid, which my son was born on my birthday, which will be the same day of the situation occurring. So
you were at the hospital that day?
And before the hospital, I was at the bar, which still have cameras there.
So Kyrie, do you know anything about the Heather Bogle
I don't
case?
know nothing. And what hurts me the most is I wish I did know something to be some help, because the pressure, it hurts me. It hurts me to have to take all this pressure.
I always say, you know, and we've said this on this podcast many times, if someone's accusing me of something that I didn't do, I'm going to be angry. I mean, what these three people went through, and in the face of the actual evidence directly undermining what O'Connell was trying to do here. The evidence did not support his theory.
Not at all. Not at all. There was no evidence. Except the Mickey Mouse T-shirt.
Which is not evidence, that's a coincidence.
And there really was no motive. I mean,
no.
I mean, so, yeah, I mean, you usually want to start there, somebody that's got a motive, and these people, there was none.
And by this time, we were just fearful for everybody in Sandusky County that has to live under this type of justice. We were mad.
So you had mentioned O'Connell, that you'd seen him do things that you'd never seen a detective do before. Can you think of a particular instance where you're just like, wow, what happened here?
Are you familiar with Lee Noss? I think Lee Noss was 19 years old or 21. He went to a bar in Fremont, and then he called his father, and he passed out on a stoop, and somehow he ended up in a dumpster. And then the garbage truck came, and it crushed him to death. And O'Connell was the detective on that. And there was a sheriff's deputy who numerous people said the sheriff's deputy tossed Lee Noss in the dumpster as a practical joke. And I think that might be what happened. I mean, I think it is what happened. I'm not going to name the sheriff's deputy because he's retired and I don't want to get into that. But, you know, we looked at the report, you know, the investigation was a big old fat report from the Sandusky County Sheriff's Office, and it was filled with inconsistencies. But several people said the sheriff's deputy tossed him into the dumpster as a practical joke, and that the guy was a practical joker, you know, and several people said that also, other people that we talked to. But O'Connell never interviewed that deputy, never asked him.
So you're saying this deputy could have been responsible for this man's death, being crushed in this?
I don't think he meant to kill him.
Wow.
But he caused his death.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
I think that is what happened. He caused his death. I mean, that I'm convinced
Unbelievable.
of. I'm convinced of it. I think he was 19 years old, Lee Noss. His mother called me once because she wanted justice, but then she was afraid to ever call back, and she never called again.
Wow. I mean, you just never hear of anything like that.
It was horrible.
Wow.
And then they explained that he he crawled into the dumpster. You know, well, first off, the dumpster was this top thing. You know, it wasn't here, it was on top. So he would have had to climb up to get in. And why would you crawl into a dumpster? It just didn't make sense.
Yeah, so a lot of things didn't make sense. I was able to interview Sheriff Chris Hilton actually just yesterday. He was supposed to join us today. Something came up. And I want to share a portion of the interview where we talk about some of the evidence. Now, he didn't come in until way later. We'll try to piece all that together.
2017.
2 years later.
2 years later.
But he was able to solve this case under his administration within 5 months, what
That's
had already
right.
taken 2
That's
years.
right.
And one of the key pieces of evidence that was not only overlooked, but that Detective O'Connell lied about was DNA evidence. So let's hear what the sheriff has to say about the DNA. There are now 2 big pieces of information. That tip from the coworker at Whirlpool and the fact that the DNA from the 3 did not match what was found under Heather's fingernails that were omitted by Detective O'Connell.
In that report to the prosecutor's office, he omitted that information that their DNA did not. And his justification was, well, just because their DNA isn't there doesn't mean they didn't do it.
DNA is pretty hard to argue with.
And when it shows up on somebody when it's not really supposed to be there type of thing, it's very, very good evidence. We knew that if we found whoever that DNA belonged to, we found her killer. We knew that. Because it was so far up into her cuticle, you had to fight and scratch and claw to be able to get it that far, because Danny, after he killed her, did clip her fingernails for that purpose.
So this, to me, is the smoking gun here in all of this. I mean, this is really what landed Detective O'Connell in prison himself. Basically, he's writing an affidavit for an indictment to the prosecutor.
That's right.
And omitting that the DNA evidence found under Heather Bogle's fingernails does not match the 3 people that he's trying to get indicted. And then he also omits what you touched on earlier, which is the tip from the Whirlpool co-worker.
And he said he was going to fix that later somehow. When the judge is bringing this out at sentencing, he says, well, Judge, we were just starting. I'm going to have another presentation, like as if I'm going to give you false information now, but later I'll give you accurate information. It was surreal. That sentencing hearing was surreal. And I think at the hearing, the judge said, you go to prison right now, because she was so disgusted.
Thank God. Have you ever heard, Brian, of a case where usually if the DNA doesn't match, that's it? We don't continue to go in this direction.
I mean, a lot of times they use DNA to exclude suspects.
Right.
And it clearly did not do it in this case. And
that is horrifying and scary. Scary, scary if I'm living in Sandusky County.
yeah, and they
It was
got
horrible.
this. And I remember Kiana, is it Kiana or Kiona? Yeah, that they had actually showed up at her work to get this DNA sample. That's how they even had her DNA.
And she was a working woman.
And she lost her job.
And she lost her job.
Yeah.
She lost her apartment. She lost her job. They tossed her apartment. Then they did another search warrant where she moved in with a friend, and they tossed that place as well. She claimed Detective O'Connell was harassing her, and it was hard to argue that he wasn't. Well, obviously he manufactured evidence against her.
So at this point, the DNA doesn't match any of those 3 suspects.
Right.
There's no motive for those 3 suspects.
No.
What exactly did O'Connell have at this point other than this Mickey Mouse shirt? I mean, they said it was a shirt, and I think Kiana said she only had like a hoodie.
Yeah.
So what did they actually have?
I don't know that they
Well,
had
listen,
anything.
I asked the sheriff.
Sheriff Hilton.
Correct. We had a conversation. One of his theories was that, and this is where it's like a ball of yarn, onion, however you want to describe it. So he believes, and I think that this is a well-known theory, is that Detective O'Connell knew that Sheriff Overmeyer was participating in this illegal drug activity that he was. He himself, O'Connell, wanted a crack at the sheriff's position.
That is absolutely true.
So
he had written to the Republican Party saying that Overmeyer was going to resign and he wanted the appointment.
Correct.
The local Republican
So
Party.
he knew that by having the biggest case in Sandusky County history solved under him as the lead detective, that would bolster him to run for that position.
Yeah. He could have been sheriff. He would probably still be sheriff today, and that would have been so horrible.
So listen, I also asked Sheriff Hilton about how a detective could have this mindset, and here's what he said. How do you even comprehend as a law enforcement officer the idea that someone, and it happens, would blatantly, potentially put 3 people away to prison for the rest of their lives, knowing that there's a high probability that they had nothing to do with it, and someone else who did is still out there?
I don't know how to. I don't know that I can answer that question adequately, because it rocks me to my very core of what I believe and how I got into this job in the first place. But some people, it was more important to solve things than it was to solve them correctly. And I think that's kind of where he was at. It was all about just getting it done because he was getting beat up in the media. He was getting kind of dragged through the mud in the media, and that was regionally.
You mean with people who were wanting the case solved?
Yes, and the ineptitude and the claims from, again, newspapers in Fremont and Sandusky saying that basically he wasn't doing his job appropriately and why hasn't this been solved and blah, 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 blah. And I think he got caught up into his own theory. He wouldn't look at any other theories, and his desire to solve that case. And the thing is he picked on 3 minorities who are arguably not what you'd call the pillars of the community, but not bad people, that they were easy targets. They were black, they were poor, they had criminal records.
What's your reaction to that?
He's right. And there were other cases where people were wrongfully convicted and subsequently removed from prison because it was proven.
And your article that you wrote, you're basically the one who came out and just bam, shed a light on this. There may have been talk behind the scenes, but you actually wrote a very explosive article saying that Sheriff Overmeyer and Detective Sean O'Connell have a history of bungling cases. And you say that this is the case that really blew the lid off 30 years of corruption within the county.
Well, my theory was that there had been no solid leader for 30 years, so nobody knew how to be a professional policeman. There was no example of it. So that's what was happening. And then you let someone like Detective O'Connell be your lead investigator, because he was with the Fremont Police Department before he was with the sheriff's office. And he and Sheriff Overmeyer were, partners on the drug task force in previous years. So what was your question?
Well, you really exposed that there was a history of corruption here. And so I think when a reporter does that, it is so important because it allows these 3 people to be taken off the hook for something they didn't do.
Right.
And it even potentially, it should say to other defense attorneys in the area who have defended clients under investigations led by O'Connell and the entire department to step forward and say, whoa, we need to take another look at my clients.
At every one of those. Any case that was questionable.
And it tells anyone living there, you don't have to be a minority, you don't have to be, it tells anyone that this could happen to me.
And yes.
To be wrongly accused.
Yes, and it happened.
That is horrifying.
It happened to at least a half a dozen. I think that story has photos of the victims, the Limberios family, the Patrick Baker was falsely convicted. There was a man who was driving his car when he got into a road rage incident with the car behind him, and somehow the car behind him flipped, and he went to his home and parked in his barn, and O'Connell arrested him. And he's coming up to trial, and he decides he wants the 911 call because he was on the phone when it was happening. and they didn't have the tapes of the 911 call. Well, you always have the tapes of the 911 call. You didn't have the tapes for a specific reason, because it showed he was innocent. They were that close to sending him to prison. You know, it's just amazing. There's so many.
You can write a book,
like
not an article. A book.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we, you know, I took a lot of grief because I hammered that story, I think, from Limberios, which was, I think, 2012 to 2017. Between all of these different cases, there might be 400 stories.
Jacob Limberios is the story where basically this was a young kid hanging out with his friends, drinking. He had a gun.
Right.
Ends up dead.
Right.
Nobody thinks that these kids intentionally shot him. It was more of an accidental thing. But then the coroner comes in and rules it a suicide, which the family says, whoa, no one's trying to put these kids in jail.
Right.
We don't want our son to be seen as someone who committed suicide when that's not the case. And then when you have a suicide death, your family's unable to collect on insurance. You had a young daughter. So let's touch on that.
And never was able to collect the insurance.
So that was another bungling.
Yeah, the death certificate was never changed. The coroner, John Wookie, he's not the coroner any longer, had ruled it an accidental suicide. So because Jacob Limberios brought a gun, he was reckless. And because he got shot, as a result of his recklessness, he ruled it a suicide. So he had a 5-year-old daughter. And the family didn't even know it was ruled a suicide until 3 months after he was buried, because they didn't get the death certificate. And the death certificate, I think, to this day, still says suicide. And that's not unusual, unfortunately, that death certificates are not accurate.
And did they exhume his body?
Twice. The family exhumed his body, and a coroner in Pittsburgh, a famous coroner in Pittsburgh, examined it in a day and then brought the body back the same day from Pittsburgh. I can't remember. You would recognize the coroner's name. It wasn't Dr. Michael
Dr.
Bodden.
G?
No.
Anyway.
But then, and then 6 months later, they were doing a coroner's investigation because the family was fighting it, and the coroner ordered the body to be exhumed, and for no reason. They were, from my point of view, they were punishing the family for fighting them.
Mm-hmm. So there was, and I did talk to Sheriff Hilton about that one. He believes that it should not have been deemed a suicide, but he basically said the way that it was handled, there's nothing that he unfortunately can do. His family, Limberios' family, was just glad that they now had a new sheriff. But there was also another suicide that was related to the Heather Bogle case, and that was the mother of Daniel Myers' child. That also sheds light on whether Daniel Myers killed more people than Heather Bogle. But I spoke with her sister, and the woman's name was Leanne Sluter.
Yes, okay.
And I spoke to her sister, Lorianne, on the phone, who still believes that Daniel Myers killed her sister, that she did not commit suicide. And that's another one where Sheriff Hilton fully believes that this was not a suicide. But the way, again, another bungle, the way that the scene was handled, basically he said that the investigators went in and took Daniel Myers' word for this, that she killed herself.
Yeah.
And so they didn't investigate it first as a homicide, which is what you should do when there's a dead body, and then clear that possibility.
And it was a shotgun, and it would have had to been aerobics to be able to shoot herself with this shotgun as she's lying in bed. It didn't happen that way. I'm sure of that. It didn't happen that way. And so you didn't do it the first time. You didn't investigate this properly the first time. And had they investigated it properly, Heather would still be alive.
For example, taking gunshot residue from her hands, from Daniel's hands. Is it on her clothing? Is it on his clothing? Those things were not done. And
That's
so
right.
to expect someone to come in years later, Hilton, and be able to correct all those mistakes, unfortunately, this family is living with possibly a suicide on their sister that could have been a murder.
And never was it resolved. So they let it just sit there. I don't know if O'Connell was the detective on that. I don't think he was, but But the point is there was no justice in Sandusky County. Your chance of getting justice in Sandusky County was not good, not good. And your chances of being falsely, incriminated were good.
Yeah, so going back to O'Connell, at some point he gets taken off of the Bogle case, and it's related to this DNA, correct? I mean, how was that all discovered, and how was he taken off the case?
Well, the way I remember it, O'Connell and Overmeyer, Sheriff Overmeyer, were tied at the hip. And we started asking both of them, who's in charge? Who's in charge? And the sheriff said, I'm in charge. And O'Connell said, he's in charge. So they had a split. And when they split, that's when the house of cards fell in, because they were at each other.
Backbiting.
Overmeyer had accused O'Connell of mishandling the case, and O'Connell had accused Overmeyer of being incompetent, and he made it known about the drug problem. I think the first time he spoke of the drug problem. The sheriff's drug problem was discovered by the 5 chiefs of police in Sandusky County, because the sheriff himself was going to their drug drop-off boxes and taking the drugs from their, when people don't use their drugs anymore, when someone dies and they have amphetamines, they drop them off. But he would go to the sheriff, the police chiefs, and take the drugs. Well, the chiefs, this is evidence. They have to treat this as evidence. So they actually reported it to the Attorney General, who was Mike DeWine at the time. Now, I don't want to disparage Mike DeWine, because I think the Attorney General's office has been broken and not very useful for the entirety of history. It just doesn't do a good job. It's not really a police agency, it's a support agency. So it was just a mess. It was just a mess.
So they both go to prison. Overmeyer goes for the drugs and
for 4 years,
and O'Connell goes for 2 years on the tampering with evidence charge, I believe it was.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Both of them in plea deals.
Right.
Which really means that they're not arguing with all the charges. They're just conveniently making a deal.
Correct.
And the public doesn't really understand. Even reporters sometimes don't understand that. They're not off the hook for all this other stuff. In fact, O'Connell was charged with starting a criminal investigation of me, which I didn't even know that they did until they came to the plea deal, and the prosecutor said, oh, by the way, they had to get me to agree to drop the charges. You drop the charges, that's okay. But,
so,
he didn't find anything.
So then Sheriff Hilton is elected in 2016.
And it was a 3-man race, Overmeyer,
who still got 12% of the vote, sitting in prison, by the way.
And Consolo was a longtime deputy, and Hilton. And Hilton, his campaign was, I'm going to solve the Heather Bogle homicide. That's my first priority.
Smart to take advantage of all of the corruption that had now been exposed by you.
And he related to the Limberios family. So and then he did it. And then he did it. In 5 months.
He solved the Heather Bogle case. So tell us, we're getting into the Daniel Myers territory right now. He comes in and he starts top to bottom investigating. He starts with Heather Bogle happened to be in her first same-sex relationship. That had gone bad in a volatile way. Heather Bogle had text messages on her phone that were pretty ugly from her brother because she had not passed her nursing exam.
Right. And he regrets that to this day.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. And then they also revisit the 3, Kyrie, Kiana, and Omar.
Right.
And they also revisit the tip that was left out by O'Connell about the Whirlpool coworker,
the email. I think it was
Danny
an email.
Myers.
Yeah.
So here we are, and the DNA doesn't match.
Right.
But I think Sheriff Hilton, he initially suspected the ex-girlfriend, right? Because I think I think it was like a Wednesday when Heather went into work, and earlier that day, her and her, I guess it was an ex at that point, they had gotten into a pretty angry fight, and there was kind of back and forth.
And just going off what he told me yesterday, you go back into the old-fashioned police work, which is who are the people closest to the victim.
Right.
Let's put aside the three for a minute.
Right.
And the person closest to her at that time was this girlfriend,
Right.
and the texts were heated. So that's really the way it should have been investigated.
Right.
Is to the core members who possibly had problems with each other, and that was the brother and the girlfriend is where he kind of started.
Right. Where the brother Josh. You're exactly correct. And the family was instrumental in, because O'Connell was telling this side of the family one thing and telling this side of the family another thing. So he was trying to keep the family not united in their pursuit of justice. The girlfriend was a natural suspect, like you say. She was a natural suspect. But the family didn't necessarily believe she did it. They believe she's a suspect because we don't know who did it. And the family never gave up. The cousin, the sister, and Josh. Josh is the one who exposed O'Connell first, because he saw O'Connell playing games with the family, and he spoke of it. Josh was pretty amazing. He never gave up.
So I asked the sheriff also how they get to Daniel Myers, and here's what he said.
And I'll never forget the day she called all of us back into the detective's office, and she shows us, and I have it over here. She shows us this picture of like a Google Earth picture, and all of these little circles going around this one place, and she's like, "That's where she went." I'm like, "What do you mean? That's where she went?" So, unbeknownst to most of us, she knew, but we didn't, that if your phone is on and you have an active Google account, your phone directly connects to a Google satellite every 10 minutes. You don't have to do anything. It just does. Not through a cell tower, right to your phone. And what happened was we traced it. 6:17 a.m. she left her factory. Within 10 minutes, she was parked in Danny Myers' driveway. Now, we didn't know that. So we see this, it's a trailer. We're like, who the hell lives there? No idea. That was the first time we figured out who Danny Myers was.
Duh, why wasn't this done by O'Connell in the first place?
The first week it could have been solved. And meantime, this rabid killer, for 2 years, he's free. I mean, it's amazing that as a detective, you would not want to get the bad guy.
At what point do they get Myers' DNA?
I think shortly after they knocked on his door. Yeah, I think it was shortly after they knocked. And I think it was a tussle, but they got it shortly after. And they had him dead to rights.
Yeah, and Myers had some pretty interesting behavior. Like, he went to the funeral. He donated money
despite saying that he barely knew her.
Right. And he wrote like a really complimentary
I miss you
message
on her GoFundMe page, and donated money.
Yeah, like he donated about $150.
Here's his name on her funeral register there. And we have the GoFundMe picture as well, where he writes to her, there it is, and donated $125 and signed his and his child's name to this.
And Matt, you obviously know this, but when you're thinking of like someone who commits a murder, it's not unusual for them to try to show up at a search, talk to the media, maybe donate money like this, because they're trying to make themselves not look like not a suspect.
Because he knew he was, if there was competent detective work, it wouldn't have taken long. I remember O'Connell saying once, before he stopped talking to us, which, and as a reporter, when they stop talking to you after, not giving you any credible information for a long time, it's like, well, okay. I mean, because you're not a very good source. But I remember him saying at one time, well, we had such little evidence to go on. And I'm thinking, you had a body in the trunk of a car, for God's sake. You had a lot of evidence. I mean, oh.
Yeah, these cell tower records, and then of course there's DNA underneath Heather's fingernails. And the fingernails were like cut down to like the
quick.
So somebody was
Which
trying.
is very diabolical. That's a typical serial killer behavior to think to that extent, to cut her fingernails down.
Yeah.
Now, the sheriff explained to me that her DNA, his DNA, was buried so far under her fingernails because she fought like heck to get away from him. But he also did some other behaviors that are truly sociopathic. So those text messages that were sent by Heather Bogle's brother to her because she did not pass her nursing exam. Working at Whirlpool was not her end game.
Right,
she wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to have a better life for her and her child, and she was pursuing that. She was unsuccessful at first, and there were some family tensions. The brother was texting things like, "You're going to turn out like mom," and some very hurtful things. Now, Daniel Myers was so sociopathic in the way that he befriended her. He got her to tell him about this whole nursing exam and the problems with her brother. Went out and purchased nursing books. And then that's how he got her to his trailer. I'm going to help you. But what was the murder really about? I mean, he wanted her physically. But then she rebuffed him in that trailer.
She just wanted to be friends.
And it was a rage killing.
I think so. I think you're right. Yeah. And he was, well, you have the video. He's kind of a frightening looking defendant, I would say, especially given all you know about him by that point. But I think that's right. It was rage. I mean, obviously it was rage.
But these behaviors to basically research Heather Bogle, to invite her, to clip the fingernails, to sign the guest book, to donate to the GoFundMe. This takes us down the road of, has he done this before?
Yes.
Would he do it again? Your thoughts?
Well, I think the Leanne Sluter,
which is his previous relationship,
the mother of his child, who
allegedly committed suicide, according to the coroner,
and lived just down the street, and they had a nice mobile park home where they lived, nicely appointed, and she lived 2 doors or 3 doors down from him. So there's that, which is very suspicious, but who knows what else? And and we tried, at that point we tried to find out all the unsolved homicides in Sandusky County, and there were like 7, but they didn't have any records.
What do you mean they didn't have any records?
Well, they didn't have any. They didn't give up any records, and we didn't sue them for records. I mean, we moved on, but there were.
So you're saying it's possible?
Oh, I believe. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And who knows? I mean, if you have a lead detective, and again, he was with Fremont for 20 years, and he had only been with the sheriff's office for, I think, 4 years at that time. Well, 3 years he was with the sheriff's office. So he retires from the police department and moves to the sheriff's office. And I remember the Fremont police chief, after he was convicted, the Fremont police chief called me up and said, I am so sorry. I would have never believed this. I worked with him for 20 years. And I would never have believed this. So I thought that was, a good, I mean, it wasn't very bright, but it was good that he was acknowledging that his coworker was not a good detective, was a bad detective.
Yeah, Matt, as you're talking there, I remembered something else about the case. Weren't there several women that actually came forward after Myers was arrested and said, he raped me, he attacked me.
Yes.
But they hadn't gone to the police, right?
Right. They approached, I mean, Sheriff Hilton knew about those, and he wasn't able to pursue a criminal case at that point because the women were assaulted, they weren't killed, and it had been years before. And by this time, he's in prison for the rest of his life. So I don't know that.
And they also found in his trailer videos of women that they think did not know they were being recorded. So he was also a sexual deviant.
Yeah, so we don't know what happened. And in fact, I mean, if you look at the history of Sandusky County, you don't know what happened in anything because it was so dysfunctional. I mean, at one point, the chief dispatcher was passing out from opioid overdoses. And then the sheriff, Sheriff Overmeyer, was the leader of the county drug task force who was
stealing drugs.
And an opioid addict. And he was so how does this work? You know, you're just like, oh my God.
Yeah, and Matt, we're not even mentioning Tim Braun, who actually ended up prosecuting Myers in this case.
Yep.
He got thrown out of office eventually.
For sexually harassing his female staff, and in one case, sexual contact, improper sexual contact. I forget the exact nature of it. He was, I remember he had concocted a criminal case against members of his staff because files had disappeared. All their files had disappeared. And he was conducting an investigation. I remember calling him because, you know, I knew him a little bit, you know, because he'd only been prosecutor a few short years. And I called him and said, what is this about an investigation that you're conducting? And he said, Matt, you know, I don't talk about investigations that I'm conducting. I said, you really have no business conducting this investigation. I mean, this is your office. You know, and he basically swore he would never talk to me again. And again, this is a person who has no credibility, so you have to move around that.
Well, I think it's a good time to talk about where you as a reporter see Sandusky County now. And has Sheriff Hilton truly come in there and restored trust and changed the way that things are done?
Oh, I think unequivocally that is true. I mean, Sheriff Hilton has integrity. He's thorough. He hired a good staff. He's a well-trained officer. He was a commander, but he was not with the sheriff's office. He was with the Perkins Township Police, which is outside Sandusky, but a fairly large police department. He was a shift supervisor or a commander with the Perkins Police. So he had leadership experience and he knew what he wanted to do. He lived in the community and he never knew it was this bad. I mean, you can't know it's this bad until you know the families that it impacts. And I got to know the families just because, I don't know, I was asking them, what's going on? And I remember the Limberios case, when that happened, it was like, it's so sad that, that this happened. And then I remember talking to the family and trying to get more information. And through the reporting that we did, the family finally became trusting of our reporting and opened up to us. And that's how we were able to do that story. With the other story, Lee Noss, and what was the other one I mentioned? Lee Noss was the dumpster death. There was another story. There were so many stories back then that were mind-boggling that this could happen in our community here. Yeah. And it was frightening. I mean, I would be, if I was driving to Toledo and I had to go through Sandusky County, I was nervous. I mean, literally nervous because the sheriff's office certainly, well, Fremont police didn't like me either. And the sheriff's office didn't like me, and who knows what could happen. I wasn't overly nervous, but I was very aware that, okay, I'm in Sandusky County. All right, it's 5 miles up, I'll be out of Sandusky County.
What was it like for you as a reporter during all this? Because we face pushback from police departments all the time, and it's hard because you have to rely on them to get information sometimes. And so it should be a two-way street. They should acknowledge, listen, not every story is going to be great about you. We're not going to necessarily cover your this police graduation and your, promotions and all this stuff. all the time. There's going to be times where you have to come forward and say, this happened, this police officer or this detective did do this. It's a two-way street. So being in such a small community and being really the only reporter that was out there saying, hey, we've got corruption here, how was that to navigate, to try to get to the bottom of it?
Well, you know, you always have to protect yourself. You have to protect your news organization. So you can't allege things. You have to go by documents, by you know, formal paperwork, effectively.
Right.
You can't just allege something. So, I mean, and once a police chief, you know, proves themselves to be unreliable and dishonest, they're no longer a source. I mean, you can't treat them as a source because they're lying to you, so they can never be treated as a credible source. So you have to look for credible sources and look for, in the Limberios case, there were court documents, there was a lawsuit, you know, so I could look to that to report about. In all the cases, there was somewhere you had to go to keep moving.
Well, Brian always says, and I like this, you know, you don't have a preconceived notion in your mind about what the story is. You let the information take you there.
That's right. Well, and that's just like we were talking earlier about, you know, why did Detective O'Connell allegedly try and frame these three young people? I don't know. I don't know what motivated him. And he never answered that question.
Yeah, because when you think of wrongful convictions, one of the most common reasons for it is because the police officer has tunnel vision. And they're like, you know, this is a suspect, I'm not looking at anybody else. But in this case, I don't even know that it was tunnel vision.
No, I don't think it was. I don't think it was because he knew he was. The judge said, you manufactured evidence. He knew he was doing that because he said, oh, I was going to clear it up later. He said, well, why do you do that now to clear it up later? You know, it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. And you're right.
Yeah, so before we get out of here for this week, where's everybody stand? I mean, so where's...
Yeah, things are copacetic in Sandusky County nowadays, right?
So, yeah, but...
I think so. I mean, the Fremont police... you know, they have a new chief. They're down to they're probably the second chief in the last 10 years, or Chief Wensinger. You know, and really professional acting, polite, public service. I mean, like you said, the reporters, we're not the enemy. You know, especially when you know we've proven ourselves. We've shown that, you know. So I can't say enough about Sheriff Hilton, of course. Sheriff Hilton has really served the community well. The Fremont Police under Chief Wensinger has been great, always responsive.
But what about O'Connell and Overmeyer and the Daniel Myers? Is he being investigated for anything else?
I don't think Daniel Myers is going to be in prison for the rest of his life. I don't think he's being investigated for anything else. O'Connell, I don't know what happened to O'Connell, and I don't know where he is or what he's doing. I heard from his lawyer friend recently, who told me I hurt people and destroyed their lives, and I'm a horrible person. And I wrote back and said, sir, you know, your friends went to prison. What are you talking about? So I don't know.
I've had to write those emails too, where the people don't want to blame themselves for the action. They want to blame you for reporting on the action that landed them there. And then Overmeyer, here he is now. He's a anti-drug advocate.
Yeah. And I think he means well by that. I think he does. I haven't talked to him. I have a podcast, Between the Lines, and I invited him after he got out of prison, and he came.
Wow, I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, it's probably available. So that must be 6 years ago. And he seemed sincere, but Overmeyer is a person who should have never been sheriff. You know, he should have. He didn't have the maturity to be sheriff. he's like a 7th grader, like almost a fun 7th grader, you know, like woo.
And we've seen several instances of that, honestly, in other aspects of government in Sandusky County as well. That still continue to this day, alleged, over in the courthouse.
Well, the courthouse has its issues right now. Did you talk to Sheriff Hilton about the courthouse?
Yeah, he had described it much the same way that you just did. Very juvenile.
Yeah, and are you going to pick up on that? Because I don't know.
We've reported on it a bit.
We did.
Reported on it a bit.
You know, I recently retired, and well, I'm in the process of winding down my career, and there are so many stories out there. There are so many stories out there. I mean, do you ever cover Seneca County?
Yeah.
That's a good time.
Yeah, it's a good time.
But there are things that reporters do that serve the community, and we're needed. We're needed.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And that's why I think you've been such a great guest today, to really show kind of what it's like to pull at these strings and then actually get those results. Hey, there is something here, because we do have a lot of people that come to us and you want to believe that there's no corruption here. You're going to go, your tendency is to go with what you're being told by police. And kudos to you for really, especially in a small community, for being the one to beat the drum on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And kudos to you, too, for covering this story now. And, of course, the Cedar Point story from a few years ago, which I absolutely loved, and served the community in a tremendous way. So congratulations to you as well. And thank you for inviting me on this program.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Matt.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for joining us here for this case of Case Files. We'll see you next week.